these molecules aren't supposed to be around if you are not starving or fasting, right?
Correct.
And they're not supposed
Yeah.
to be this high. So it's just kind of a weird or interesting or unique situation. We have maybe a couple of studies trying to look at exogenous ketones in people on a ketogenic diet. And again, there's none of those studies show that there's a benefit or an improvement in performance. So now flip that to the non-keto, the
High
high
carb,
carb
say.
or
So yeah,
regular athlete,
regular diet. Yeah.
yeah. So
Jonathan, exogenous ketone supplements are becoming more mainstream these days, right? But before we get into the science of exogenous ketone supplementations, could you give us a sense of how much of your career have been spent devoted to studying and researching ketones?
yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me on, and always good
You're
to
welcome.
chat about ketones and ketosis. It was probably about 10 years ago that we got into to studying exogenous ketones. We were exploring ketogenic diets and ketosis. Primarily, my focus of my research is on metabolic health,
Okay.
type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, and we started studying low carb and ketogenic diets. And then we also study inflammation, and we got really interested in this new role, which I'm sure we'll get into, of
Yeah. Yeah.
ketones as kind of signaling hormone molecules, which were affecting inflammation. And then these new exogenous ketones came out, and we said, hey, this
Yeah.
is a pretty cool way to be able to study this, where we can now raise ketones without having to have someone go on a ketogenic diet or fasting. So that was about 10 years ago when we got into this. And that was right around the time, well, I'm sure we'll talk about this too, the big splash with the Cox cell metabolism paper in 2016, which
Mhm.
kind of kicked off the exogenous ketones for performance and
Yeah.
elite cyclists and all that other stuff. So yeah, so we've been focused on this in the lab for the last 10 years or so.
Okay. But before that, you were studying ketosis and metabolic health and the ketogenic diet. Okay. So a
Correct.
long time, basically.
Yeah, I've been studying metabolism for the last 20 years or so.
Okay.
Carbohydrate and fat metabolism first, and then into more glycemic control, metabolic health, and then add ketones to the mix for the last 10
Okay.
years.
So between someone entering nutritional ketosis through fasting or carbohydrate restriction and someone simply taking a ketone supplement, are these two states producing the same physiological effect, or are they fundamentally different?
Yeah, no, they, in my opinion, my view, they're fundamentally very different. So
Okay.
we'll get into a little bit. We can go deeper, as deep as you want to go here, but I'll set it up. Endogenous ketosis. This is when your body's producing its own ketones. That
Okay.
situation has a few metabolic characteristics, which I think are very different than exogenous ketones. So the first is when you fast or starve or follow a ketogenic diet, your insulin levels, insulin is the hormone that
Yeah.
regulates our blood sugar. We all know about that. Insulin also regulates fat metabolism. It's a very potent inhibitor of lipolysis, so the breakdown of fat from our adipose tissue. So when insulin levels are low, your adipose tissue lipolysis is high and it releases a lot of fatty acids. That makes sense because if you're starving or fasting, you're not eating anything. So let's tap into our body's energy stores, which is our adipose tissue.
Yeah.
So normal starving, fasting, ketogenic diets is low insulin, high free fatty acids, low or stable blood sugar, right?
Mhm.
Those fatty acids go to the liver. And when the liver is in a state of having a high amount of free fatty acids delivered to it and insulin is low, the liver will take some of those fatty acids and convert them into ketones. And we call that ketosis. So it's
Okay.
taking fat and converting it to ketones. In general, the idea there, the easiest way to think of it is your brain can't use fatty acids for energy. So when you're fasting or carbohydrates are limited, your brain needs an alternative fuel source. It can't use the fat and it knows that glucose is limiting. Well, your liver converts the fat to ketones and your brain loves ketones. So your brain will take up the
Okay.
ketones. So this ketosis is thought of as kind of the way to keep the brain fueled. And obviously the brain's fueling is important if you're, an animal who would be starving and needing to then go look for food. Other tissues can use the ketones too, and we'll probably get into that, skeletal muscle being one of them, heart, for example. So endogenous ketosis, low insulin, high free fatty acids, high ketones. When
Okay.
we take exogenous ketones, and we'll
Mhm.
get into this, some exogenous ketones actually aren't ketones, they're precursors to ketones. But if we take
Okay.
exogenous ketones, you are essentially drinking the ketones that normally your liver would make. However, those ketones raise insulin a
Okay.
little,
Yeah.
and the ketones directly themselves inhibit lipolysis. And we've shown this, and others have. It's quite a potent response. So when you do exogenous ketones, you now have a situation where you don't have low insulin, you have a little bit higher insulin. You don't have
Mhm.
high free fatty acids, you have lower free fatty acids, and you have
Okay.
high ketones. So the scenario is to me quite different
Okay.
in endogenous ketosis and exogenous ketosis because of that mix of insulin, free fatty acids, and ketones. It's jumbled up in exogenous ketosis.
It's kind of a paradox, right? Because you think that if you're taking in ketones, you are taking in some form of energy that is not affecting your insulin, and you want to stay in that so-called fat burning state, right? But if it raises insulin, then it kind of kicks you out of that fat burning state.
A little bit,
Uh,
yeah. No,
a little
don't
bit,
get me,
right?
yeah, don't get me wrong. The insulin spike from exogenous ketones is not the same as the insulin spike from taking in glucose or
Oh yeah,
sugar,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
but
for sure.
it will essentially double your fasting insulin. So you go from very low to low amounts of insulin, but it certainly does inhibit adipose tissue lipolysis. And we'll probably get into this, but this is one of the reasons, is to me a simple reason why if you're on a ketogenic diet in ketosis, in endogenous ketosis, it makes very little sense to me to then take extra exogenous ketones because those exogenous ketones will inhibit your own ketone production and block
Yeah,
it for the period that you're taking those exogenous ketones. So you're kind of kicking yourself out of endogenous
ketos.
ketosis while you take this exogenous ketones. And to me, that doesn't make that much sense. There's very few studies on that, but the one study that looked at exogenous ketones in athletes on a ketogenic diet showed no performance benefits. And that makes sense to me because you're kind of working against yourself by taking exogenous ketones while on a ketogenic diet.
Is the mechanism of the exogenous ketones kicking someone off their ketogenic state? Is it due to the rise of insulin? Is that what causes them to get
Two things. The
okay?
rise of insulin, probably one. I would say it's maybe minor. I'm putting numbers that I don't. I'm coming out of thin air. 30% of it
Okay,
might be the
okay,
insulin, but I would say 70% of it is the ketones themselves. Beta hydroxybutyrate, in particular, which is the major
okay,
circulating ketone body. There's a receptor on your adipose tissue, on your adipocytes, where beta hydroxybutyrate binds to that receptor and directly inhibits lipolysis to decrease free fatty acid release. So you have less substrate then for your liver to make ketones. And that's a direct effect. So I think that's the more important one. When ketones
okay,
rise after exogenous ketones, you are blocking lipolysis, reducing the availability of free fatty acids. So your liver just doesn't have as much substrate to make the ketones, and that's probably why the main reason.
okay, okay. I definitely want to get into that a little bit more later, but
Sure.
first, are there benefits that come specifically from nutritional ketosis over exogenous ketones?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is all metabolism, and I think all science and physiology context matters, and it depends what
Yeah.
your end goal is or what your objectives are. So, I think
Okay.
that there are. So, particularly, what I study in kind of metabolic health, obesity, type 2 diabetes, when you're in endogenous nutritional ketosis, so whether that's through fasting or a ketogenic diet, one of the things we know that happens on a ketogenic diet is people tend to lose weight and lose fat, and it will help to stabilize their blood sugar levels. So, if your goals are weight loss and stabilizing blood sugar levels, then nutritional ketosis, endogenous ketosis,
Mm.
has those benefits. And we have not seen those benefits of weight loss or improved metabolic health with exogenous ketones, for example. So I think that would be one of your goals. If your goal is to be a prolific fat burner during exercise, for an ultra marathon or something like that,
Yeah.
ketogenic diet would have that effect because it's rewiring your metabolic machinery to be a prolific fat burner. Taking exogenous ketones every day is not rewiring your metabolism to be a prolific fat burner. So that would be another example where, depending on the goals, there's going to be different effects there. And I think we, have every diet comes with pros and cons, but I think we have a lot of evidence that a ketogenic diet has many pros for people living with obesity, insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes. Has a few cons for sure. The LDL cholesterol increase or total cholesterol increase for some people is certainly something we would want to look out for. But there's trade-offs. But I think we have pretty good evidence there. We don't yet have very good evidence that taking exogenous ketones over multiple weeks or months has really any metabolic benefits at all. We've been studying that. There's some signals in those data, but it's certainly not the same magnitude of metabolic rewiring improvements that you see with a ketogenic diet.
Okay. I've heard the argument that one reason why a ketogenic diet is more effective for fat loss and body recomposition is because people tend to be on the lower overall calories because it's tough to eat so much fat. Could that be a reason as well? I mean, I do appreciate the fact that, yes, insulin is kept low throughout the day. And, I kind of think of insulin as like the jail warden, right? They when they come out, the doors are closed and fat doesn't get released. But when they're away, doors are open and fat can be released. So that's for sure. But yeah, do you think that it could be also a reduction in calories that add to that effect? If you're using your sports watch or a generic formula to calculate your zone 2, there's a very good chance that you're not training in your true zone 2. And that's not because they are intentionally doing anything wrong. They simply don't know your individual physiology, so they estimate your training zones using population-based formulas. The problem is that if your zone 2 is estimated incorrectly, you can spend months or even years training in the wrong zone without ever realizing it. And that's a much bigger deal than most runners think. Zone 2 isn't an arbitrary heart rate. It's your own individual physiological tipping point where your body reaches its highest rate of fat oxidation before it starts relying heavily on carbohydrates. That point is different for every runner, and it also changes as you get fitter. So no generic formula can tell you exactly where it is. Which means if you're training from estimated zones derived from formulas, there's a good chance you're not training the energy system you think you are. Below your true zone 2, your body adapts to become better at burning fat, building the aerobic base that supports everything from endurance to speed. Drift just above it, and now you're training your body to rely more heavily on carbohydrates instead. That's not a bad thing, but it's a completely different adaptation and not the one you're aiming for. For years, I've used heart rate to measure training intensity, but heart rate is influenced by things like heat, hydration, caffeine, sleep, and fatigue, just to name a few. Then I thought lactate was the gold standard until I realized that lactate also changes depending on glycogen availability and your nutritional state, making it just as inconsistent as heart rate. That got me thinking that your breathing is one of the closest reflections of what's actually happening metabolically because it's driven by your body's physiological response and not easily influenced by those external factors. As exercise intensity increases, your muscles gradually shift from burning more fat to burning more carbohydrates, which produces more carbon dioxide that your body has to remove by increasing your breathing. That change in ventilation happens at your own individual physiological thresholds and not at a generic percentage of your maximum heart rate. That's why learning about the VitaPro from TimeWear was such a breakthrough for me. Instead of estimating training zones from generic formulas or indirect markers, it measures your breathing in real time to identify your own individual physiological thresholds that are not influenced by external factors. If you're serious about building your aerobic base, improving endurance, and making sure that every zone to run is actually doing what it's supposed to do, I think it's well worth looking into. TimeWear is giving listeners of the Endurance Lab podcast $100 off their pro training membership when you use my link in the description with my code ELABTW26. And if you'd like to understand the science behind it all, check out my full conversation with TimeWear founder Anar Larson, also linked in the description below. But yeah, do you think that it could be also a reduction in calories that add to that effect?
100%. So
Okay.
I think, I'll throw my numbers of the benefits of a ketogenic diet for weight loss or metabolic health are just that you're consuming less calories, right? I'm a believer that yes, there's metabolic differences, but you can't lose weight if you're not in negative energy balance, right? So, this idea of a metabolic advantage of a ketogenic diet, if it's there, it's very small, right? The main reason why someone might lose 5, 10, 15 kilos on a ketogenic diet is because they're eating less calories, right? And I always use the analogy here of, in North America, go to Starbucks on a ketogenic diet and tell me what you can eat. You can have black coffee and egg bites, right? So 2 items on the menu that you can eat. Everything else is off limits, right? So it's a good example that just the food selection that you can eat on a ketogenic diet is down.
Yeah.
So that if you're strict and you're following it, that's going to reduce your intake. And then you're right, maybe there is some effects. You can't eat so much fat or protein. Maybe there's a little effect of the ketones themselves inhibiting appetite in your brain, et cetera, that are kind of contributing to that. But by and large, those kind of weight loss metabolic effects are because you're consuming less calories. And there's data to support that. People will spontaneously eat less calories if they're following a ketogenic diet and sticking to it.
Yeah, I guess also because fat and protein is so much more satiating than carbohydrates, right? I mean, eat a piece of cheese compared to a piece of bread, you stay fuller for longer.
Correct. And on a ketogenic diet, think again the Starbucks example. Another one, just we hear a lot about ultra processed foods and refined carbohydrates right now. Well, if you're on a ketogenic diet, there's a whole bunch of those ultra processed junk foods that you're cutting out of your diet.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And so then you'll tend to not overeat because those foods are off limits on a ketogenic diet.
Okay. Let's try and put this through a lens of a runner or a master's runner or athlete.
Yeah.
So under the assumption that the fats and carbohydrates we're about to talk about are derived from healthier whole foods, right? Not the ultra processed foods that we just talked about. So for example, avocados, nuts, seeds, olive oil, eggs, organic, grass-fed beef, in the high fat approach versus your legumes, beans, whole grain, starchy vegetables, fruits in the higher carb approach. So for a master's athlete, is there a subset of these athletes that benefit more from a high fat ketogenic approach versus a high carbohydrate approach?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, again, here, context matters. So I would think, I can think of 2 scenarios where I would suggest, again, individualized approach would be needed, but where I would suggest a high-fat keto diet might be better or at least worth considering. So the first would be in an ultra marathon or ultra endurance athlete, right? If you're running 100-mile races, 50-mile races, etc., being a prolific fat burner is going to be helpful. And I think we have case studies and some studies, Jeff Volek has studied some of these ultra marathoners on ketogenic diets to suggest that, is it optimal? Not sure. Is it possible? Yes. In addition to being the prolific fat burner, one of the things I think when any ultra marathoner would know, the GI distress that you get or you could get during races from having to consume high amounts of carbohydrates over 8, 9 hours,
20 hours
on race day can be debilitating, right? Like that could make or break someone's race. And if you are on a ketogenic diet and are this prolific fat burner, and your carbohydrate requirements or what you need to eat during the race is lower, you could be in a scenario where that could be one of the benefits, right? So it's not only that you're a prolific fat burner, it's that you have less chance of a GI disturbance because you're consuming less carbs on the day of. So I think that might be one scenario where this is good. The other one, again, context matters here, would be, say you're a middle-aged, overweight male who is trying to get back into running or run. You're not elite, so we will probably get to this. If you're elite and you're running a 10K, half marathon, up to a marathon, you need to be able to be a carb burner, and we can get into the reasons why. But that's going to be for elite. But if you're overweight, middle-aged, getting back into running, if you lose 10, 20 pounds on a ketogenic diet, now you're carrying around a 20-pound less backpack. You don't have your 20-pound backpack on anymore. And it doesn't really matter if you're, able to burn carbohydrates at the maximal rate. That's probably a scenario where a ketogenic diet helps someone perform. And I think this is where, influencers or that sort of thing, they're like, oh, ketogenic diet is the best for performance. Look at this. I think a lot of those might be based on, that scenario, right? If you lose 20 pounds, you're going to be a faster runner, regardless of what fuel you're burning.
Right.
So I think those two, for me, would be the scenarios where I would think a keto approach would be good. If you're an elite, like I said, marathon distance down, and you're elite, I don't think a ketogenic diet is optimal for you, because burning carbs is more energetically efficient, more oxygen efficiency while you're exercising at a high intensity. But again, that's not the majority of people, I think, that are out there running races.
What about a masters athlete that is chasing a new PR? So, not someone that is carrying excess baggage or the backpack, but someone that is relatively lean like yourself and myself, has been running consistently. Could a high carb approach be suitable for them, given that the carbohydrates they're consuming are not ultra processed, they're whole foods, while still maintaining their metabolic health?
Absolutely. So I think, and again, there would be context or individualization, but I recently, as we were chatting before, got back into racing. I would consider myself a middle-aged, I'm not trying to PR, but trying to run as fast as I can over 10K. And I think, my performance is going to be optimized, or at least better, on, I don't know if I need to worry about a high carbohydrate diet, but just a kind of regular diet with, 50, 60% of calories coming from carbohydrate. Because when I'm doing my workouts, when I'm running that 10K at, as fast as I can go, I'm burning mostly or almost purely carbohydrates at that intensity, right? My RER is going to be close to 1 or at 1 for the duration of those efforts. And in that scenario, we know this from classic stoichiometry of burning carbs versus fat, but the excellent studies that Louise Burke has done on the elite race walkers, right? You're more oxygen efficient burning carbohydrates, which means you could squeak out a little bit more ATP for the limited oxygen you can take in, and translate that into slightly faster performances. And I don't think if you have, this is how I always explain it to people, with the people that we mostly study in the lab with type 2 diabetes. So if you have glucose intolerance and type 2 diabetes, then when you consume carbs and you get this huge rise in blood sugar, that's not very good for you, right? And that causes oxidative stress, inflammation, can damage your blood vessels. If you're lean and insulin sensitive and can process those carbohydrates, when you consume them from non-processed foods, healthy carbohydrate containing foods, your blood sugar doesn't spike up to 15 millimole. It might go up to 7, 8 millimole. And within 2 hours, you're back down to normal, because you're very good at handling those carbohydrates. So having a little bit of carbs and a little bit of a blood sugar excursion is not damaging to you. So I think you can certainly maintain your metabolic health on a higher carbohydrate diet. And it's probably optimal for your performance in running.
And your insulin is kind of doing its job, right? That's why
So
you are not having that super high escalation.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So, I heard it said before, like, if you don't have type 2 diabetes or insulin resistance, your insulin works very, very well, surprisingly well, and you have kind of no issues dealing with those carbohydrate loads that you take in. So
Politically, is there a risk to consuming sports drinks and gels while training and racing? Not in a sedentary, relaxed state, but when you're on the go, you know?
yeah, so great question, and I know many people in the keto world will point to that as this
Yeah,
is a potential downfall or
risk. Yeah.
danger or conspiracy theory if you're on that side of it, that it's going to cause diabetes. So I would say two things there. One, we don't have any evidence that consuming carbohydrates causes type 2 diabetes and impaired metabolic health, right? Actually, if you look at the data in healthy people, it's almost the opposite. You improve your insulin sensitivity if you consume carbohydrates. Um,
Really?
yeah, so that's one thing there. However, we don't have the studies of people consuming sports drinks and sports gels every day for 15 years, and to see the effects, right? So I think we have to be, I'm willing to change my mind if we see the data that someone who consumes sports drinks and gels ends up having impaired metabolic health, but I don't think we have that data yet. Um, and
Anecdotally, I know of someone.
sorry.
Anecdotally, I know of someone that's claimed that.
Yeah,
Jeff. You
and I've
mentioned
seen
Jeff
that before.
Volek. You
Sorry.
mentioned Jeff Volek. You mentioned Jeff Volek just now, and Stephen Feeney, who did a lot of this high fat, low carb studies on athletes, and I think they started this company called Verta Health
Yeah.
with Sami Inkinen, who used to be like a triathlon world champion, like a age group world champion, who claimed that through consuming sports drinks, he gave himself pre-diabetes.
Yeah. So
So
I've
yeah,
seen,
yeah.
I've also seen on the other side, someone who's followed a low carb ketogenic diet. Over time, people tend to not stick to that diet. You tend to
Mhm.
be better, more strict when you start, and you drift at the end, or over time. And I've seen people who have followed a ketogenic diet, and then 3-4 years later, they're more insulin resistant, and their blood sugars start to rise. And one theory there would be, by following that high fat diet, you've promoted insulin resistance, which doesn't go away. So now you're stuck, and you have to follow that high fat, low carb diet for the rest of your life because you're not able to deal with the carbohydrates. So I think there's probably anecdotes on both sides of that. We don't have
Okay.
studies though on that. So,
Yeah.
and I would say, on the population or the large level, if you're not gaining fat, particularly visceral fat, because
Mhm.
of your, those dietary choices, I don't think that the, highly active person consuming the appropriate amount of carbohydrates to fuel their training, it's going to cause these effects. That being said, does the everyday Joe athlete need to be consuming sports drinks and gels and
Gels.
all that during their typical training? Probably not, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I use the example of my daughter. She's 16. She's into running. She's training, reasonably seriously, 50, 60 kilometers a week
Okay.
of running, competing in cross country and track. And she sees on Instagram these, influencers having their caffeine sports gel before they go
Mhm.
for their, 5K morning run. And she's telling me, oh, I need to try these gels. And I was like, you absolutely do not need a gel to go for a 30 or 40
5 day.
minute
Yeah.
run in the morning. And you probably don't even need a gel at any time in your training, because you're not doing anything, more than about an hour run. So
Yeah.
in that scenario, it's probably then leading to, potentially extra calorie intake or unnecessary
Yeah.
calorie intake. And most people like that could, I think, easily get their carbohydrate requirements from real food and don't need to worry about having those kind of products. But they certainly can make it more convenient
Yeah,
for
for
you.
sure. Yeah. So would you say that if someone is going out and doing anything more than 90 minutes like an endurance session that's 90 to maybe 120 minutes or maybe even up to 3 hours, they have a case for consuming gels and sports drinks on those
I think
workouts.
so. Yeah, we often use, obviously it's individualized, but we often use that 90-minute,
Yeah, treasure.
number.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a hard and fast rule. It's not like at 90 minutes you run out of muscle glycogen and,
Yeah.
and you're bonk, right?
Yeah.
But it would make sense. And again, depends what your goals are, right? So if your
Yeah.
goal is to maximize your performance and run as fast as you can that
Yeah.
day, then yes, I think that the data would certainly suggest that. If your goal is to maximize your fat burning, push
Yeah.
your body, make your mental, make it feel as bad
Yeah.
as you can, then don't do that. And I think we know that this is where the art and science of coaching comes in, right? And that
Yeah.
coaches
Where to
use
find a
often
balance.
do as a distance runner, right? You often do your Sunday long run fasted in the morning, right? And that was very traditional. Well, that's not because that's the optimal fueling strategy for that run. It's probably just how we did it, but that's probably pushing your body to try to rely more on fat in that
Fat. Yeah.
session. But it's a long, slow run. You're not worried about what your
Correct.
exact pace is and maximizing performance. So once a week, you get your kind of fat burning run.
Stimulus.
But if you wanted to run as fast as you could on that Sunday morning, you would probably want to properly fuel for that bout. But that's not the goal of that run. So
Correct. Okay. Going back to exogenous ketone supplements. From my understanding, there are two main forms: ketone salts and ketone esters. Is there anything else that I missed?
yeah, so I think there is. So there's also
Okay.
ketone precursors.
Okay.
So
I
these
thought so
are
because you mentioned that earlier.
Yeah. So let's go through them. So ketone salts, they probably kind of came around first. That is just most of them are beta hydroxybutyrate, which is the main circulating ketone body, coupled with a positively charged ion, sodium or calcium or magnesium. Most of them are sodium. So you have the beta hydroxy with sodium. You consume that in your guts. That's broken down. You absorb the sodium and you absorb the beta hydroxybutyrate. You're trying to get the beta hydroxybutyrate. It's a negatively charged ion, so you have to couple it with the positively charged.
Okay.
The salt is the problem there, right? Because when you put all of those positively charged ions into your gut, you get a flood of water there, and that can lead to GI distress. So I don't think it's the beta hydroxybutyrate, which is causing the GI distress with the salts. It's the salt. We know that from sodium bicarbonate, which has been around for 20, 30 years of athletes using it. If you take that in the old form, when you just scooped it out of the box,
mix it with some water and you chuck it.
many people would get GI distress there, right? Because of that osmotic effect of the positively charged ion in your gut. So I don't think ketone salts are that beneficial because you can't take enough of them, the BHB part, to raise ketones without having either the risk or the true effect on your GI system. So I know there's companies trying to market the salts as a low release of beta hydroxybutyrate so that you don't have a spike, and that I haven't seen the evidence that really is beneficial or would have any effect. So the ketone esters, and that's probably a bit of a tricky term. So to clarify for the listeners, when people say ketone ester, they're most likely or probably referring to the ketone monoester. That's the one that was developed by Richard Veach at NIH, Kieran Clark at Oxford. It is beta hydroxybutyrate, so the actual ketone molecule, with one ester, monoester bond, and one convert to beta hydroxybutyrate. So the ketone monoester, in minutes, BHB is up in your blood. The 1,3-butane goes to your liver. Your liver converts it to BHB, and then you get this kind of secondary increase in BHB. So that's ketone monoester. There are other companies then calling their molecules ketone esters, but they aren't actually the ketone monoester. One of those molecules doesn't actually contain any ketones. It's a ketone ester, they call it, but it is 1,3-butanediol coupled to a short chain fatty acid with an ester
Okay.
bond.
Okay.
And in that molecule, you take it in, your gut breaks that. The 1,3-butanediol goes to your liver, makes beta hydroxybutyrate. The short chain fatty acid goes to your liver, makes beta hydroxybutyrate, and you get an increase. So you get an increase in beta hydroxybutyrate through those precursors, but they're not actually ketones. So you have to be a bit careful when you just read and it's even a problem in the literature. There'll be papers published in scientific literature that say ketone ester does this, and then you read the paper and it's not actually a ketone
Okay.
ester, it's a precursor.
Precursor. Okay.
And then there's also being marketed now, is just the 1,3-butanediol on its own, but many companies will call that ketone, or they'll call it a ketone. Again, it's not a ketone, it's a precursor. You take it in and your liver converts it to ketones. And then obviously there's, that this field is exploding. So I don't know all of the different molecules by all of the different companies. But that's kind of the general ketone salts, ketone monoester, and then other compounds which might call themselves a ketone ester or a ketone, but they're really just precursors that your liver will convert to ketones. We don't know the difference between all of these things, right? Okay. When you take them, they lead to slightly different kinetics, slightly different increases in ketone. Nobody's done all of the studies to say for sport performance, ketone salt versus monoester versus precursor versus 1,3-butanediol, which one works and which one has effects. We've been doing the majority of our work with the ketone monoester, which I think is the most potent, the most direct way to raise ketones. And that one, I suppose, is in the US, it's mostly the ketone KE4, it's called. And in the UK, that's the delta G or T delta S ketone. But again, these companies, for example, Ketone also makes a 1,3-butanediol product. So you got to be a little bit careful if what you want is the ketone monoester.
Okay, but that doesn't mean that the precursors are not effective. It's just not studied enough, right?
Correct. There's more and more studies coming out with the precursors. If you believe that it's just the increase in beta hydroxybutyrate, which either signals or I'm sure we'll get to acts as a additional fuel or a fourth macronutrient, it probably doesn't matter too much on whether it comes direct or is made by your liver. But we don't know the long-term effects. We don't know whether there are differences in some of these yet, just because the studies haven't been done.
Is there a difference between the D and the L beta hydroxybutyrate?
I think so. Again, not enough research has been done there, and many people probably read this. The enzymes which break down ketones for you to be able to use them, and you burn ketones in your cells, and that's probably one of the theories, or at least one of the mechanisms of why ketones might be working. The enzymes can only break down the D isoform of beta hydroxybutyrate. So again, for the listeners, it's like molecules have handedness, right hand, left hand, right? And the D form, the right hand, if you want to think of it that way, enzymes can only see and shake hands with the right hand. They can't see the left hand. So the D will be able to be metabolized by cells. The L form will not. However, both the D and the L form do appear to be able to signal. So we talked about beta hydroxybutyrate acting like a hormone almost and being able to signal. It looks like the D and the L can both be able to signal. So you might get some different effects. There's some evidence or suggestion that the L form over time can get converted into the D form in the body. So you might have the L form go up. It can't get metabolized, but it gets interconverted to the D form and then is able to be metabolized. These studies are really, really hard to run in humans to trace where this is going. Yes, there's a difference. We don't fully know the differences yet. I think one of the ideas that the companies making the L form are one of the arguments or the suggestions or the hypotheses is that the L form will have these signaling effects and is more long-lived. So you might be able to trick the body into being in low-level ketosis for longer, because if you take the L form, it can't get metabolized, so it stays elevated in the blood for many hours. So you could kind of dose, twice a day and be in ketosis. It's a theory. I
Okay.
know some colleagues who are studying that. We literally have zero evidence in humans that what the L isoform will do, or whether it has any of those effects. We're just starting some studies right now in the lab to try to tease out some of the signaling effects of the D versus the L supplements, and we'll know more in a year or two.
Okay. Okay. Um, Between the rate of ketones rising in the blood and the absolute level of ketones, which is more important to focus on?
Great question. Again, I don't mean to sound like a broken record here and say that we need more studies, but I get asked this question a lot.
Okay.
Is there a threshold, and what level do we need to get to? And we simply don't know that answer,
Okay.
especially for different scenarios, right? So as context matters, we don't know yet whether being above zero point 0.5 or above 3 or whatever millimoles it is having any different effects on the receptors, the signaling, the fuel utilization, or anything like that. So I can't make a firm answer on that. What I would say there, based on the evidence and our experience, is that I definitely don't think it's a situation of if some is good, more is better, right? So I
Okay.
don't think
Yeah.
you need to say, I need to rise my beta hydroxybutyrate to the highest level possible because that's going to give me more benefits. Probably not. There's probably some happy medium where you want to be. And the reason I say that is if you drive beta hydroxybutyrate up really high, we've done some studies,
Mhm.
we just published some studies, the maximal dose you can take of the ketone monoester, BHB goes up to 5 millimole, right? So
Okay.
normally, if you're not in ketosis, I wake up this morning, I don't follow a ketogenic diet, my beta hydroxybutyrate would be probably 0.2
Okay.
millimoles, right? So we can raise that to above 5 by taking a big dose of the ketone monoester, right? So that is
Okay.
a 50-fold increase in my beta hydroxybutyrate levels. However, when I do that, my blood sugar drops to about 3 or 3.5 millimoles. So it goes
Okay.
from 5 to 3. My free fatty acids drop from about zero point 0.5 to 0.2, and my insulin level goes up about 3 times higher than it was at rest. So I've jacked my BHB up, but I've dropped my glucose and dropped my free fatty acids, right? And if you're an athlete trying to compete, or a runner, that's
Yeah. You need
possibly
more.
probably not the ideal scenario, right? To have lots of beta hydroxybutyrate, but not a lot of glucose and free fatty acids. So I
Yeah.
think that's a good example of higher is not better. Now, if you got into a scenario where you're taking something in a supplement and you get your BHB to 2 or 3 millimoles, and your glucose is about the same and your fatty acids are a little lower, now you might be in a scenario where you're getting some of the signaling benefits of the BHB if they exist, and some of the fueling benefits. So I would say, can't answer, but it's probably not more is better. And then, there is some studies, and again, they're not a lot of them with, so if you take these exogenous ketones, ketone monoester, within 15, 30 minutes, your BHB levels are high, and they may last for about 2 or 3 hours above your basal level. If you exercise in that time, they tend to drop a little bit more, suggestive that your
Okay.
muscles or some tissues or your heart maybe are using them. And then there's some studies that then will dose again with ketones during exercise, right? So you have your pre-dose, you go up, it starts to go down, you dose again, and that kind of more prolonged, sustained increase in ketones might have different effects. Again, we just don't have the data. There's, one study suggested you get a performance improvement. Another study suggested you got actually a performance decrement by doing that. So it all depends on the context of that kind of sustained versus acute rise.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, it's quite challenging to pass out, right? With the specific response. So, like you said just now, the context is everything. So, let's take two scenarios, right?
Okay.
Let's take a ketogenic athlete,
Okay.
a midlife ketogenic athlete, and a high carb athlete.
Okay.
Both are running a marathon, and both consume ketone esters.
Okay.
What's going to happen to both of them during the race?
Yeah. So I'll have to pontificate or speculate here
Okay.
because
Okay.
we don't have that specific study. But as I mentioned before, so the ketogenic athlete, they would have low insulin, high rates of lipolysis, lots of free fatty acids around. Their liver is converting some of those free fatty acids to ketones. So they already have a basal level of ketosis. We haven't got into this. When you exercise, particularly prolonged exercise, your liver will produce some ketones regardless of if you're on a ketogenic diet or not. And that's because
Correct. Yeah.
lipolysis is elevated. Your liver sees more of that. And during the late stages or immediately after exercise, your liver will produce some ketones. So that athlete already has basal ketones. I'll throw some numbers there. Again, context matters, but you might be at 1.5 or 2 millimoles BHB if you're on a ketogenic diet. Strict, right? So again, non-ketogenic diet, 0.2, 0.3 millimoles.
Yep.
On a ketogenic diet, 1.5 to 2. So tenfold, increase in your ketones.
And at this state, we're talking about endogenous, right?
Yes, endogenous.
Yeah. Okay.
So they're sitting at, again, we'll make the numbers easy, 2 millimoles, and they start their race, right?
Yeah.
If
correct.
they're going to then take ketone monoester, exogenous ketones, they can probably get that up to 4-5 millimoles with that exogenous ketones.
Both athletes can get to 5.
Well, just the endogenous the ketogenic.
Just the okay, yeah. Okay.
Right? So we'll call it the delta will be 2 or 3 millimoles from your baseline.
Okay.
So you're at
got it.
At 2. We can get that up to 4 or 5 with a reasonable typical dose, right? However, we don't have these studies. As I mentioned at the start, that increase in ketones will inhibit lipolysis in that ketogenic athlete, reducing the substrate, the availability, the free fatty acids for making their own ketones. So you probably have a little bit of a tug of war going on there, right? You've added the exogenous ketones, and they're going to knock down the endogenous ketosis a little bit. So maybe instead of getting to 4 or 5, they only get to 3 because they're getting the exogenous and then they're inhibiting the endogenous. But there's still more ketones than that what they would have if they didn't take the exogenous ketones. I don't think that those extra ketones that they take on, the ketogenic athlete, are going to be able to be used as fuel in any appreciable way to enhance their performance. Okay. The reason I say that is that we know that your skeletal muscle, which is the primary organ that is propelling you through that marathon, is not really a very big consumer of ketones or beta hydroxybutyrate to fuel energy, right? And these are studies even from the Oxford group who made the ketone monoester. So if anything, they want to see that ketones are used, a lot. And they've done these studies, and you might get, between 2 and 5% of the energy during exercise is actually coming from ketones. So even if we're really generous and we say they haven't done these studies in keto adapted athletes, during long duration exercise, et cetera. So even if we're really generous and say, hey, if you're keto adapted on a ketogenic diet, you can double your capacity to oxidize ketones. It might be 10% of the energy coming from ketones. So I don't think if you add a little bit of extra ketones, you're going to get this massive boost in performance. Because in that athlete, 10%, I'm being generous, at 10% might be coming from ketones. 70% is coming from fat, or 80%, and 10 or 20% might be coming from carbs, which is primarily from their muscle glycogen stores and gluconeogenesis. So I don't think you're going to get this performance improvement by giving them some extra exogenous ketones. So that ketogenic athlete taking exogenous ketones, I don't see a lot of rationale metabolically, scientifically, physiologically for an improvement in performance.
Would it blunt their performance
It could, yes.
because
So
of the spike in insulin and the drop in?
yeah, exactly. So they may then
Yeah.
have, like usually we think fat is not limiting, but they could be in a scenario there where by blunting their lipolysis and
Lipolysis.
endogenous production, they could be in a scenario, and it's going to lower. We've shown many times the exogenous ketones are going to lower blood sugar a little bit.
Okay. So it
So
kind of drains all the energy source, all the substrates
yeah,
away from.
or inhibits it, right? And again,
Yeah,
it's
inhibits.
not
Yeah.
this simple, but exogenous ketosis is a weird situation for the body, right? These molecules aren't supposed to be around if you are not starving or fasting,
Correct.
right? And they're not supposed
Yeah.
to be this high. So it's just kind of a weird or interesting or unique situation. So I don't think that, again, there's the rationale. We have maybe a couple of studies trying to look at exogenous ketones in people on a ketogenic diet. And again, there's none of those studies show that there's a benefit or an improvement in performance. I don't think any show explicit impairment in performance, but I don't know if those studies have been done with that as the purpose. So now flip that to the non-keto, the
High
high
carb,
carb
say.
or
So
regular athlete.
regular diet. Yeah.
Yeah. So that might be the scenario, or at least that's the theory where exogenous ketones were pitched as being potentially performance enhancing. When they were first came out, they were marketed as the fourth macronutrient, right? So we consume carbs, fat, and protein. We normally don't consume ketones; they're only made. But hey, now we can consume them. So there's a fourth macro, an extra fuel, a backup fuel, additional fuel that you can take. That athlete, maybe 2 to 5% of the energy that they're deriving to fuel their exercise could be coming from ketones. So the rationale for giving it a little bit of an extra boost with this fourth macronutrient, it is, to me, pretty low chances. So in that athlete taking just exogenous ketones, I don't think that there's rationale that it's going to improve their performance. Again, we have 20, 30 studies, all different scenarios there. 3 of them show a performance benefit, 20 show no effect, and 4 show a performance impairment, right? So to me, it's a wash. Now, there's obviously different combos in that non-keto adapted athlete probably for their marathon should be consuming carbohydrates to maximize their performance. So then there's some studies where you combine carbohydrate ingestion with ketones. So now you're doing, hey, I'm doing the optimal fueling. I'm carb loaded, carb replenished. I'm having carbs. Now I'm adding ketones on top. And to me, that's the only scenario where I could see some rationale that maybe you can boost the performance a little bit. If we go to the scientific evidence, it's not strong that would actually improve their performance. Again, 2-3 studies that show a performance improvement, 20 that show no effect, a couple that show an impairment. But that would be the only scenario where I think that would be the case. So I don't think
all of performance implications, that would be the only scenario. Really?
Yes. So this is for acute performance improvement in that race. Where we probably should get to is where the ketone work or ketone literature, exogenous ketone literature is going, and that's in the recovery and the potential effect of the ketones post-exercise to enhance recovery and adaptation and all those sorts of things. And I think, I don't know because I'm not on the inside of Tour de France teams and things like that. I know we're talking running, but we can probably apply cycling.
Yeah.
Apparently, some of the teams are still using exogenous ketones, right? And I don't think it is for the acute performance boosting effects because the literature is pretty convincing, I would say, there that there's not many scenarios where exogenous ketones are improving acute performance. However, there's some studies coming out that they may enhance recovery or adaptations, and
Okay.
that might be why the athletes, the Tour de France athletes, are still
It
using
makes
them.
a lot of sense, right?
I have one more theory of why the athletes are still using them, and that is
Okay.
because we haven't got to it. The ketone monoester in particular does not taste very well. It's a horrible tasting supplement, right? Some of the newer ketones are better. They're better tasting, don't taste as bad, but the ketone monoester doesn't taste very good. And we know there's a big placebo effect, right? And
Yeah.
the bigger pill you take and the brighter color pill, the better placebo effect you get. So if you're a Tour de France athlete, training 6 hours a day, your dietitian and performance, everything is dialed in, and you add this horrible tasting supplement on top of that,
Yep.
that someone tells you might improve your performance or your recovery, and you get a bit of a placebo effect because it's such a horrible tasting thing, then that might be the reason, and go for it, right? Because you would want to get any benefit you get, and the placebo effect is real.
Correct.
So I think it could be a real recovery adaptation, or it might just be a placebo effect. These things are really expensive and they taste horrible. They must work,
Correct.
if I take them. So
Okay. Just like you mentioned that some studies showed a decline in performance. What is the mechanism that caused that decline?
yeah, so we've done a little bit of this. This is with my colleague Marty Gabala. Devin McCarthy was the PhD student, and in a series of studies, we showed that we called it cardiorespiratory strain, or your ventilation rate and your heart rate were actually higher when you took exogenous ketones than when you didn't. And this is probably because of acid-base balance, right? So ketones,
Okay.
beta hydroxybutyrate is an acid. So when you take it, it acidifies your blood. When you acidify your
Okay.
blood, it shifts your bicarbonate and it produces more CO2, and you have to breathe that CO2 off. So you breathe a little bit heavier, a little bit more.
Correct.
And when you breathe a little bit more, that costs some oxygen, some energy. So your heart
Correct.
pumps a little bit harder. And we showed in some of those studies, it's subtle, but there's a little bit higher heart rate and a little bit higher ventilation when these highly trained athletes were taking high doses of the ketone monoester. So we were trying to get ketones, at 3.5 millimoles. And they had this higher cardiorespiratory strain, and we linked it in a couple of those studies to a small decrement in performance. So I think that might be the mechanism that it might be having that subtle effect. Again, there's nuances to these studies. Some of them we did with carbohydrates, some of them we did without, and that sort of thing. So it was more pronounced if you had only ketones, not with carbohydrates, but we still saw a little bit of it with the ketones plus carbs. There's some of the ketone supplements, again, the salts, and then there's some, not the ketone monoester, which do cause some GI distress. And I think it's, maybe not. So it's not a metabolic effect on performance, but if your GI, if you have GI distress a little bit higher,
it's going to affect your performance.
Your performance. But the ketone monoester, again, in our experience, and there's meta-analyses on these, there's a slight increase in GI symptoms, but it's like on a scale of, we do a scale from 0 to 100,
Okay.
and it will be 5 or 10 millimeters more. So you get, when you have placebo, your GI symptoms are 10 out of 100, and when you have ketones, it's 17 out of 100.
Okay.
So it's
Okay.
to me, it's not clinically meaningful in that case.
Yeah.
But we did one study with ketone salts, and we had a few of those participants, they had to run to the bathroom at the end of the exercise session. So for them, it was a clear GI distress issue for some people.
So considering everything that we've just discussed about ketones and performance, so if a runner is going to come to you and they say they wanted to try ketone supplements, exogenous ketone supplements to improve their marathon performance, what would you actually tell them?
I would say, I don't think that you need to take them on the day of the marathon or during the marathon to try to improve your performance. I would say, you can give it a try in one of your long runs or workouts if you want, to see, because again, maybe the placebo effect, or maybe there's something there. But again, that the evidence just doesn't support acute beneficial effect on endurance performance. However, I would say there's some emerging evidence that exogenous ketones might be able to augment or improve recovery and adaptation. So maybe if you want to spend your money and you want to take these supplements, you could consider looking at that from a recovery standpoint. So I guess we'll get there right now. So what are these possible benefits on recovery? So there's a couple studies that exogenous ketones might be able to enhance muscle glycogen resynthesis after exercise.
Okay.
Right? So we know muscle glycogen is the carbohydrate stores in our muscles. And when you exercise, particularly if it's vigorous, you will use those carbohydrate glycogen stores in your muscle. That's what we talked earlier, that the 90 minutes of bonking, hitting the wall, that's
Correct,
often cited as, again, it's not this simple, but when you're starting to run low on your muscle glycogen stores, it's about 90 minutes. So some of the early studies suggested that ketones might be able to augment muscle glycogen resynthesis. That's probably not a big issue for most people, but if you're training twice a day and you want, you do a run in the morning and then another run in the evening, so you're fairly elite or fairly dialed into your training, replenishing your glycogen quicker might be able to allow you to go harder in that afternoon run. Or you do a run on Friday afternoon after work, and then Saturday morning, you got your workout. Yeah. Well, maybe if you can replenish glycogen faster, you're now setting yourself up so you can work a little harder, train a little harder in that next session. So that could be one. Data on the muscle glycogen resynthesis, a bit mixed, but that might be one. Second one,
I guess this only applies to the non-ketogenic athlete, right?
Correct. Yeah. So again, we'll keep it there. This study made a big splash. There was a study came out that exogenous ketones enhanced EPO or erythropoietin.
Oh, really?
In human. So, and it was about the same magnitude of EPO increase that you get if you slept in an altitude tent. Okay.
Oh, really?
So
okay.
All we know is the hormone that stimulates your body to make more red blood cells. One of the reasons why you might live at altitude or that is to try to get EPO to go up, make more red blood cells. Why people, Tour de France athletes have been caught taking EPO, and for doping, right? So again, these are proof of concept type of studies. So when people had exogenous ketones after a bout of exercise, their EPO was a little bit higher. Nobody's done the study to then say, if we do this over many, many weeks or months, do you actually make more red blood cells? Those studies are going on right now. I can guarantee you that there's people doing that. But that's the other possibility, right? So if that was the case, hey, I'll take ketones after exercise if I'm going to get, some of the benefits that I would get if I lived at altitude or whatever. And then there's, again, a few studies, context, nuance dependent, that ketones after exercise might improve your sleep. So these are studies by Chiel Paffe in Belgium. Again, the studies are nuanced. It's highly trained athletes doing a 1 hour HIIT session 1 hour before they go to bed, and then they have ketones after. So I don't, and that usually disrupts your sleep, right? If you do a hard exercise,
before bed,
you don't sleep as well. And in the athletes that in the condition where they did the hard exercise an hour before sleep and had ketones, they slept a little bit better. So, again, nuanced evidence that ketones might enhance your sleep. We all know now how important sleep is for recovery and performance, right? We used to think nutrition and training, that's what I got to optimize. Well, I think sleep is just as important for
very
athletes.
important.
Nutrition, training, and sleep to be optimized, because very simply, that's when all the adaptations are happening to the training,
especially as we get older.
Yeah. So if ketones could enhance sleep, then maybe you get better recovery. So again, these are a handful of studies. So for that athlete, I would say don't worry about taking the ketones on race day or as a supplement to enhance your performance, but try taking them in the recovery after. And then there's one other area. Again, we're doing a little bit of work on this in ketones and muscle protein balance. So ketones historically have been shown to inhibit muscle protein breakdown, kind of allow you to hang on to more of your muscle protein. Again, that makes a little bit of sense. If you're fasting and starving, that there'd be this evolutionary signal. Maybe it's ketones that says, hey, stop breaking down so much muscle. We don't want to become cachectic, so we'll ramp down muscle protein breakdown. So if ketones can enhance muscle protein balance, your muscles might be able to, less breakdown of your muscles if you have ketones after exercise. So all of those, again, these are, I'm not saying these are set in stone, and I wouldn't, bet my life on it. But if I had someone who I was advising, I would say, based on the evidence, that's where I'd put my money, or my efforts would be post-exercise ketones in recovery. Maybe that's why the Tour de France athletes are still
taking
using
this. If we take a step away from endurance performance for a second, are there any other benefits of taking ketone esters outside of performance, whether it's mental benefits or brain health or something like that?
Yeah, I think I always tell people, I've been studying this in type 2 diabetes, and it's interesting. But we see slight glucose lowering in people with type 2 diabetes when they take exogenous ketones, but it's not the same effect as you'd get from exercise or typical diabetes, type 2 diabetes drugs, right? So it's a small effect. I don't think that ketones are not going to replace metformin as a diabetes medication or something like that, right? But maybe there's an effect there. But I always tell people, I think the most intriguing, encouraging, or exciting area might be ketones and brain, right? And again, very simply, Stephen Kinane, a Canadian researcher, has been studying this for many years. He explains it very well. Your brain normally uses glucose, but glucose needs to be pulled into the brain. So you need to activate brain cells, use the glucose, create a concentration gradient, and pull glucose into the brain. Well, ketones get pushed into the brain. So if ketones are up, they go into the brain, and your brain seems to love ketones. And again, it's probably evolutionarily conserved thing, right? Ketones would only ever be high if you were starving or fasting, right? And if you were starving and carbohydrate was limiting, it would make sense that your brain would say, hey, I need to use this backup fuel so that I can have the cognitive capacity to search for food or do whatever. That's how I think of it. So ketones get pushed in. Now with exogenous ketones, we can push more fuel into the brain, and we might be able to overcome some of these brain energy metabolism deficits, because we know in Alzheimer's, for example, and cognitive impairment, the brain's glucose metabolism is messed up, right? People have called Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes.
Type 3, correct.
And if you can push ketones into the brain, you might be able to overcome that. Studies are emerging on that now. Again, I don't think it's a magic bullet that we're curing Alzheimer's disease with ketones per se. But Stephen Kinane's got research on that. Others have been doing that. We've done a small amount showing some benefits of ketones on cognitive performance in people with obesity. So I think there's something there, and that's probably one of the most exciting areas. One other area that we're interested in is these ketones are also, beta hydroxybutyrate in particular, has been shown to be anti-inflammatory and reduce inflammation. And we know many chronic diseases are linked with chronic inflammation: obesity, type 2 diabetes, aging, heart disease, that sort of thing. So if we can calm down chronic inflammation with ketones, maybe there's an aspect for it there. But that research is still emerging. I would say not maybe as exciting as the brain ketone metabolism idea.
Going back very quickly, the ketone esters benefits on the brain, is that effective for a ketogenic person as well as a regular diet non-ketogenic person? Does it have the same benefits, or?
I don't know. The answer there would be, and I don't know if those studies have been done. Again, back to our idea of these things are a little bit different. If someone who had cognitive impairment, that followed a ketogenic diet, there's so many other things that are changing. It's hard to pinpoint it to the ketones in that situation, right? So because that person now would have low insulin, high lipolysis, lose some weight, lose some visceral fat, all of these have different glucose levels. So all of those things would change. So to me, that's a really hard model, if you want to call it that, the ketogenic diet, to pinpoint it to the effects of ketones. Ketones are just one of the effects. When we give exogenous ketones, we can a little bit more directly say, we think it's the ketones which had the effect here. So yeah, I don't know what would happen in that scenario.
Okay. And on the inflammation front, between a ketogenic diet or someone that's on nutritional ketosis versus just supplementing with ketone esters, which has more meaningful effects on inflammation?
Yeah. Depends on the context, as we've as a theme here.
Of course.
If it's someone living with obesity, type 2 diabetes, and the ketogenic diet causes them to lose weight, stabilize their blood sugar, then I think the ketogenic diet is going to have a lot more potential to alter inflammation than exogenous ketones.
Okay.
It is probably independent of the ketones, right? In that scenario, because of the weight loss and the stabilized blood sugar and that sort of thing. But the exogenous ketones would be a way if the ketones are acting as a signal, right? So immune cells are either have a receptor which detects the ketones and it acts like a hormone, or there's some evidence that some immune cells will then use ketones as a fuel, and when they can use it as a fuel, it alters their function. So in that case, the exogenous ketones, I think, could be a very useful tool to target the immune cells. And we just published a study which we think is really cool and where this research might be going. And we've shown that beta hydroxybutyrate, after you take exogenous ketones, ketone monoester, it goes inside of immune cells, immune cells in your blood, and it actually attaches itself to proteins, which is crazy. So you have this molecule, ketones, which goes and attaches itself to proteins. We don't yet know what that does or why it does that, but presumably when it attaches itself to all these proteins, it's altering their function and causing some sort of signaling effect. If not, why would it do that, right? Why would a molecule attach itself to proteins without some sort of functional consequence? So we think, and where we're trying to study, is that beta hydroxy, it's called beta hydroxybutyrate of proteins. So the B attaches itself to proteins. And we think that must affect some of those proteins' functions and might influence inflammation, immune function. And that's where we're kind of going with that research, to try to figure out what proteins is it attaching to, what portions of the proteins is it attaching to, and does it impact their function when it attaches to them? And that would be really cool, because then you could say, hey, if we know how this is all working, take your exogenous ketones, it goes in and acts as a direct signal inside an immune cell, alters its function. So let's say it makes it less inflamed, or it enhances its ability to fight off an infection, whatever it might be. That would be really cool. Early stages, but that's kind of the hypothesis we're chasing with that work.
Okay, so full ketogenic state will be better for somebody that's obese in terms of inflammation, but would it be safe to say that, say, a podium chaser, midlife athlete that's chasing podiums or PRs, that is, consuming carbohydrates and all, supplementing with some ketone esters, monoesters, could help them reduce a bit of inflammation?
I would say potentially, yeah.
Potentially, yeah. It points that way, right?
Yeah, and in that scenario, and this, inflammation is probably one of the hardest things. At the very least, it's a double-edged sword, right? Like, you need inflammation, because if not, you can't.
You don't heal.
Yeah, you can't attack viruses, bacteria, and you're going to die. And you need some inflammation to promote adaptation and healing, right? So you don't want to be, and we know that, if you take anti-inflammatories, your muscles don't adapt as well to exercise stimulus, right? So you kind of want some inflammation, but not too much inflammation. So once you start, trying to muck around with that, I think the prediction of what will happen is very, very tricky to figure out, right? So I wouldn't want to be as clear cut as like, take ketones to lower your inflammation, this will be good for you. That's a little bit too simplistic a view and extending the findings a little too far.
Okay. As we land the plane here, one practical thing: if someone listening today wants to meaningfully improve their metabolic health and metabolic flexibility without compromising their training quality, what would be the single most important thing they can do right now, in your opinion?
Oh, yeah, that's a tricky question. I don't think it's take exogenous ketones. So maybe we can,
Okay.
what is it not? The answer to that question would not be take exogenous ketones. This is tricky because, again, consistent exercise is probably the most important thing you can do for your metabolic health and metabolic flexibility.
More than a ketogenic diet or a high carb diet, whichever.
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
So I would say the consistent exercise component is probably the most important there. And if you put me on the spot, I'd have to say, the diet that long term does not result in accumulation of excess body fat for you, right? I don't know if that's a very profound conclusion there, but I think that's what I would have to go with.
Okay. And Jonathan, my closing question for you is: what does endurance mean to you?
What does endurance mean to me? That's a great question. I'm obviously thinking in terms of sport performance endurance, not endurance in life maybe here. So
in any way you want to interpret it.
Yeah. The endurance to me would be the ability to persevere and overcome fatigue over a long period of time. Jonathan, and then you can interpret that however you want. Is that a 1 hour long period of time, or is that a
20-hour
period of time? Yeah.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Okay. Thanks so much for having me on.